I kept that house empty the way you hide a safe. Yet my parents sold it like old junk, even rewarding themselves with a management fee. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about wasted assets. In reality, they triggered a federal protocol nobody in our family could shut down. When three black SUVs pulled up outside, they finally learned some properties do not belong on the market. They belong in classified files. I am Natalie Kelly. At 38 years of age, I have mastered the profound art of remaining entirely invisible while sitting right at the center of a crowded room. The room in question on this particular morning was the grand dining hall of my parents' sprawling estate in Highland Park, a wildly affluent and aggressively manicured enclave nestled within Dallas, Texas. It was the morning of New Year's Day, and the annual family brunch was in full swing. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating, undeniable scent of performative wealth. Heavy baccarat crystal glasses caught the sharp winter sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting fractured rainbows across imported, stark white linen tablecloths. Massive abstract oil paintings dominated the walls, pieces purchased by my mother, Diane, not because they moved her soul or sparked any genuine emotion, but simply because their price tags rivaled the cost of a high-end luxury sports car. Every single detail of the house was meticulously curated to scream financial triumph to anyone who walked through the heavy oak double doors. I sat near the lower end of the long mahogany table, dressed in a simple charcoal gray wool sweater and dark slacks. I was the widely acknowledged, designated misfit of the Hargrove bloodline. Earlier that morning, I had parked my reliable, unremarkable sedan at the very end of their sprawling circular driveway, safely hidden behind a gleaming fleet of European luxury vehicles belonging to the rest of the guests. I had brought no grand announcements to this gathering. I possessed no shiny new vehicle to casually mention over the smoked salmon, no elevated corporate title to drop into the conversation, and absolutely no flashy achievements to display on the metaphorical mantle of my family's pride. In this house, under my parents' roof, if you were not actively projecting overwhelming success, you were considered a tragic, living failure. My older sister, Kinsley Hargrove, was happily holding court at the head of the table. She was exactly 3 years my senior and navigated her entire existence as if she were perpetually pitching her life story to a hostile room of venture capitalists. Today, she was breathlessly detailing the launch of her new wellness technology startup, throwing around meaningless, rehearsed buzzwords about corporate synergy and holistic market disruption. Her husband, Grant, leaned comfortably against the antique mahogany credenza, swirling a mimosa in his tall glass. He jumped into the conversation only to boast about his latest investor relations triumphs. He dropped the names of elite private equity firms with the practiced, casual arrogance of a man who made a very comfortable living gambling with other people's money. When the two of them finally exhausted their own endless supply of self-praise, they naturally pivoted their attention toward their favorite target. "Are you still doing that worthless consultant thing, Natalie?" Kinsley asked across the table. Her tone was carefully modulated, dripping with a rehearsed, sickeningly sweet pity that she had perfected over decades. Grant chuckled softly, taking a long moment to adjust the heavy, diamond-encrusted designer watch on his left wrist. "Hey, someone has to push the paper around, right? Doing federal risk compliance sounds like a genuinely fantastic way to catch up on your sleep. I honestly do not know how you stand the sheer boredom of it all." I offered a small, polite smile and let the insult sit between us like a centerpiece. My voice stayed level, my face stayed calm. Diane mistook that calm for permission and used it to put me to work. "Natalie, sweetie," Diane called out, her voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceiling. "Be a dear and top off Grant's glass, would you? And while you are up, please clear those empty appetizer plates and take them to the kitchen." It was a classic, deeply ingrained power play. The house was currently staffed with a full, highly paid catering team hired specifically for the holiday morning. Yet she explicitly needed me to perform the manual labor. It was her preferred method of establishing the family hierarchy for all to see. The successful, brilliant daughter is allowed to speak and be served. The disappointing, mediocre daughter is expected to stand up, keep her head down, and work. I rose from my chair without a single sigh, picked up the heavy crystal bottle of champagne, and carefully poured it into Grant's glass. I gathered the fine bone china plates, stacking them silently. As I moved around the room performing my assigned chores, I simply observed them. I watched their micro-expressions, the fleeting moments of deep insecurity that they desperately tried to mask with loud voices, aggressive posturing, and expensive fabrics. Over the years, I had grown profoundly accustomed to being consistently and aggressively underestimated by my own blood relatives. What they completely failed to understand was that being severely underestimated is the most effective camouflage a person can possess in this world. They firmly believed my life was a dull, gray blur of bureaucratic monotony. I allowed them to believe it. In fact, I absolutely needed them to believe it. For many years, I had carefully fed them the lie that my career consisted solely of managing risk compliance for vague, incredibly boring federal contracts. The actual reality of my profession was something I could never speak of, let alone attempt to explain to a group of people whose definition of a major life crisis was a delayed first-class flight to Aspen. The only tangible, physical footprint of my real life that intersected with theirs was a specific property located in Fells Point, over in Baltimore, Maryland, to my family. That house was an endless source of mockery and confusion. They exclusively referred to it as the abandoned house. They knew I was rarely present there, and to their real estate-obsessed minds, leaving a piece of prime property unoccupied and unrenovated was a literal sin against capitalism. They simply could not fathom why I held on to a modest brick row house and let it sit quiet and dark for months at a time. They did not know why it remained empty, and I was certainly bound by strict federal law never to explain the truth to them. I returned from the catering kitchen, wiping my hands on a linen towel, and took my seat back at the lower end of the table. Just as I settled in, my father, Russell Hargrove, cleared his throat. It was a sharp, booming, authoritative sound, and the lively room immediately fell into absolute silence. Russell treated his family precisely like a corporate board of directors, and this holiday brunch was his mandatory quarterly address. He steepled his fingers together, resting his elbows on the pristine table. The harsh morning sunlight caught the thick gold of his wedding band. He began a slow, deliberate monologue about the pressing need for optimizing the family asset portfolio. He spoke at length about cash liquidity, sudden market shifts, and the unforgivable financial crime of carrying dead weight in an investment profile. He spoke about me and my life choices. Though he purposely did not use my name at first, he spoke as if I were merely a depreciating line item on a sprawling spreadsheet. A rounding error in judgment that urgently needed to be balanced and corrected by upper management. Slowly, he turned his head and looked directly down the long expanse of the table. His sharp, calculating eyes locked completely onto mine. It was the cold, unyielding look of a man who had already made a massive, unilateral decision behind closed doors and was now merely delivering the final verdict to a subordinate. He paused for maximum dramatic effect, ensuring every single person in the room was watching the exchange. Russell looked at me and said, "We need to talk about your Baltimore house." The silence that settled over the grand dining room was heavy and absolute. The clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china ceased entirely. Grant stopped swirling his drink. Kinsley leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, clearly anticipating a spectacle. Russell kept his hands steepled, transforming the head of the table into an executive boardroom. He did not look at me as a father looking at a daughter. He looked at me like a senior partner addressing a junior associate who had severely mismanaged a portfolio. "We have made a decision regarding that property," Russell announced. His voice carried the casual, unyielding authority of a man who firmly believed his judgment was infallible. "I ran the numbers last week. The current arrangement is entirely inefficient, letting a prime piece of real estate sit empty, generating zero revenue while you stubbornly refuse to rent it out, is nothing but wasted capital. It is a dead asset. Before I could even process the audacity of his statement, Diane leaned forward. She placed a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, tilting her head with a look of profound, manufactured maternal concern. Her voice was suddenly dripping with a honey-sweet warmth that felt suffocating. "We did this for your future, darling. You simply refused to take care of yourself or build any sort of solid foundation. We could not just sit by and watch you throw your potential away. We are your parents. We had to step in and secure your future." I kept my eyes steady. "Did what, exactly?" Russell dropped his hands flat onto the pristine linen tablecloth. He spoke bluntly, stripping away any pretense of a family discussion. "We sold it. A private buyer approached my firm looking for unlisted properties in that specific sector. They made an all-cash offer that was abnormally high. Frankly, it was a staggering overpayment for a neglected row house. I took care of all the paperwork, pushed it through title, and finalized the transfer. The escrow cleared yesterday. It is a done deal." A cold, electric hum started in the back of my mind. It was the distinct sensation of a critical containment breach. They had not merely overstepped a boundary. They had blindly walked into a highly classified operational perimeter and dismantled it for a quick payout. I looked directly into my father's eyes and asked exactly one question. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any anger or panic. "By what right did you sell it?" Russell scoffed. A short, dismissive sound. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket as if he were prepared to produce a physical document right there at the brunch table. "Do not try to play the victim here, Natalie. 18 months ago, you legally signed a limited power of attorney over to me and your mother. You authorized us to act as your financial proxies regarding that specific address." I stared at him, my mind flashing back to the exact day I signed that document. 18 months ago, I was preparing for a highly sensitive, deeply classified assignment that would require me to be completely off the grid and unreachable for 12 weeks. I had executed a highly restricted, heavily caveated power of attorney simply so my parents could legally pay the county property taxes on my behalf and authorize a plumber in the event a pipe burst during a winter freeze. It was a basic administrative safeguard. It was never a license to liquidate. That document was strictly for routine maintenance and tax compliance while I was traveling, I stated evenly. "The language was broad enough," Russell countered smoothly, waving a hand in the air. "My legal team reviewed it. It gave me the authority to manage the asset in your best interest. And liquidating a dead asset for a massive premium is unequivocally in your best interest. The deal was simply too good to pass up. Only a complete fool would have walked away from that kind of leverage." He paused, adjusting his posture, his chest puffing out slightly with unearned pride. "Now, considering the complexity of the transaction, the speed at which I had to push the buyers through the closing process, and the sheer magnitude of the profit I secured for you, your mother and I retained a 20% management fee from the gross sale. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it hung in the air. A standard real estate commission might be 5 or 6%. Taking 20% was not a fee. It was an aggressive, predatory tax levied by parents who believed they owned their child. They had sold a house that did not truly belong to them, to a buyer they did not know, and then boldly skimmed a massive cut off the top because they felt entitled to a reward for their hard work." Kinsley let out a short, mocking laugh from across the table. She picked up her crystal glass, pointing it at me like a weapon. "Oh, do not look so dramatic, Natalie. Honestly, you should be thanking Dad. At least you have a pile of actual cash now. You can finally stop living like some sort of mysterious pauper and buy a decent place here in Dallas. Maybe even upgrade that tragic wardrobe." I gave her nothing. No outburst, no tears, no performance. I set my water glass down with a soft, deliberate clink, and let the room feel what silence sounds like when it's controlled. I reached out and slowly, deliberately set my water glass down on the table. The soft clink of the crystal against the wood was the only sound in the room. I let the silence stretch out, second after second, allowing the heavy, oppressive weight of my absolute stillness to settle over them. I looked at Russell. Then I looked at Diane. I studied them the way a forensic auditor studies a ledger. Quietly. Precisely. Already counting the violations. They thought they had just executed a clever financial maneuver. They had no idea. They had just forged their own names onto a federal crime. No theatrics. No napkin toss. I stood, gave the room a polite nod, and walked out before anyone could reload their next insult. The crisp January air hit my face as I walked down the expansive, perfectly paved driveway. I slid into the driver's seat of my 10-year-old sedan. Kinsley had frequently joked that my car was a rolling cry for help, a pathetic testament to my lack of ambition. She was fundamentally wrong. A dusty mass-market vehicle with standard plates is the ultimate urban camouflage. It does not trigger license plate readers placed on high alert by private security firms. It does not warrant a single-second glance from valet attendants or neighborhood watch cameras. It is a ghost ship, and it was exactly what I needed. I drove the 15 miles back to my short-term rental on the outskirts of the city. It was a sterile, fully furnished one-bedroom apartment I leased specifically for the duration of this holiday visit. There were no personal photographs on the walls, no clutter on the counters, and zero traces of my actual personality. It was merely a secure staging ground. I locked the heavy deadbolt, pulled the thick blackout curtains completely shut, and retrieved my workstation from the false bottom of my travel duffel bag. This was not a standard commercial laptop. It weighed nearly 8 pounds, encased in a matte black magnesium alloy shell, and was entirely air-gapped from any standard public network. I opened the lid and initiated the 3-stage biometric authentication process, a fingerprint scan, a retinal verification, and a rotating 40-character passphrase. My parents firmly expected an emotional breakdown. They anticipated a frantic phone call within the hour, where I begged for the money back or screamed about familial betrayal. They deeply understood family drama, petty power struggles, and emotional manipulation. They did not understand incident response protocols. I opened a blank, highly encrypted terminal and began drafting an initial breach assessment. I did not write like a wounded, misunderstood daughter. I wrote like the federal compliance director I actually was. I documented the exact time and location of the brunch conversation. I transcribed my father's verbatim admission regarding the unilateral sale of the property. I logged his casual confession of retaining a 20% management fee from the illicit transaction. I noted the specific exploitation of the limited power of attorney executed 18 months prior. I stripped away every ounce of familial context, reducing their arrogant brunch chatter to pure, unadulterated legal liability. I was building a timeline, setting the data points of their motive and intent into concrete. Once the initial timeline was secure, I routed my connection through our encrypted compliance network and pulled the asset record tied to the Baltimore address. The screen didn't load a secret schematic. It loaded what mattered in my world: restrictions, filings, and federal flags to a county assessor. It was a tired brick row house in Fells Point. In the Federal Registry, it carried a red compliance banner: restricted infrastructure parcel, transfer review required. It wasn't just a house. It sat on top of federally regulated infrastructure upgrades tied to a protected program, and my father had pushed a civilian sale through a title office that was never equipped to touch it. There was no cinematic countdown. There was no dramatic music swelling in the background. The reality of federal security is terrifyingly mundane. I navigated to the risk management menu, selected the specific drop-down tab for unauthorized asset transfer, and clicked Submit. A small, unassuming green checkmark appeared on the screen. It was done. With a single click. I had not just frozen a civilian real estate transaction. I had triggered a cascading federal alert system. The bureaucratic machinery was now awake, and it possessed absolutely no capacity to care that the perpetrators were my blood relatives. Across the room, my personal cell phone, resting on the granite kitchen counter. began to light up. The notifications arrived in rapid, aggressive succession. My mother had initiated a group text. She was asking where I went, layering her messages with heavy performative guilt about ruining the holiday. Kinsley sent a sarcastic remark demanding I apologize for making things awkward. My father sent a blunt, demanding directive, ordering me to call him immediately to provide my banking details for the remaining fund transfer. I stood in the dim light of the apartment and watched the screen glow with their demands. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I left my phone exactly where it was and kept my thumbs still. Instead, I screenshotted the entire thread, timestamps included, and uploaded it to the dossier as supplemental proof of intent. Then, the heavy silence of the apartment was shattered. It was not my personal phone ringing. It was the secondary device locked inside my briefcase. The vibration pattern was sharp, frantic, and entirely different from a standard cellular call. It was the dedicated internal emergency line. I walked over, snapped the briefcase latches open, and pulled the heavy black phone out. I answered on the second ring, pressing the cold plastic to my ear. I did not even have the chance to state my name. The voice on the other end belonged to the overnight shift director, and he delivered a single opening sentence that made the blood in my veins run completely cold. "Natalie, the system just flagged an unauthorized transaction regarding your registered site." The screen of my personal smartphone lit up, shattering the dim quiet of the apartment. It was not a phone call or a text message. It was a push notification from a social media application I kept installed solely for monitoring open-source intelligence regarding my own family. My mother, Diane, had wasted no time weaponizing the internet. She had crafted a highly curated, deeply manipulative public post. I opened the application and stared at the image she had uploaded. It was a perfectly framed, high-resolution photograph of the grand dining table I had just left. The composition specifically highlighted the empty chair where I had been sitting, the crumpled linen napkin left beside a half-full water glass. The caption beneath it was a masterclass in passive-aggressive victimhood. It read about the deep heartbreak of the holiday season, the agonizing pain of giving everything to a child only to be met with cold ingratitude, and the silent suffering of parents who simply wanted the best for an unappreciative daughter. Within minutes, the comments section became a chaotic courtroom of public opinion. Diane held court among a chorus of wealthy Highland Park wives and country club acquaintances. They swarmed the post like sharks to a fresh drop of blood. They offered prayers for my mother's broken heart. They posted long paragraphs condemning my generation for lacking basic filial piety. They painted me as a reckless, ungrateful failure who had callously abandoned her loving family on a holiday. Not a single person in that comment section paused to ask what had precipitated my departure. Not one of them knew my parents had just liquidated my property. The narrative was permanently set, and in their eyes, I was the undisputed villain. As I scrolled through the public condemnation, a new notification banner dropped down from the top of my screen. Kinsley had created a brand new group text message thread. She had titled it Family Intervention. The messages began to rapid fire into the chat, each one more aggressive than the last. Kinsley demanded an immediate, groveling apology. She accused me of intentionally humiliating our parents in front of their holiday guests, claiming my silent exit was a calculated tantrum designed to cause maximum emotional damage. Before I could even process Kinsley's barrage, her husband Grant entered the fray. He completely bypassed the emotional manipulation and went straight for corporate intimidation. His messages were written in the sharp, aggressive syntax of a man accustomed to bullying junior partners in a boardroom. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He stated that if I attempted to throw a tantrum, sabotage the closing process, or blow up this incredibly lucrative deal, he would personally ensure that I was sued for tortious interference and massive financial damages. He threatened to tie me up in civil litigation for the next 10 years if I cost the family this payout. I sat at the small kitchen island, the glowing screen illuminating my face in the darkened room. I did not feel a single surge of anger. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. I took a deep breath, simultaneously pressing the two buttons required to capture my screen. I systematically scrolled through the social media post, capturing the image, the caption, and every single condemning comment. I switched to the messaging application and photographed the entire group chat. Ensuring the timestamps of Grant's financial threats and Kinsley's coercion were clearly visible, I was not hoarding these images to cry over them later. I was meticulously building an evidentiary timeline. In a federal investigation, proving motive is just as critical as proving the action. My family was actively documenting their desperate, aggressive intent to push an unauthorized sale across the finish line, and they were handing me the evidence on a silver platter. Just as I finished encrypting the screenshots and moving them to my secure drive, an alert chimed from my standard, civilian email account. It was a message from an escrow officer representing a prominent Maryland title company. The subject line was flagged with high-priority markers, demanding urgent action regarding supplemental signatures for the Fells Point address. The body of the email was terse and highly unusual for a standard residential transaction. The officer stated that the buyer was intensely motivated and pushing for an accelerated, virtually immediate closing timeline. They were demanding a final, sweeping waiver of all seller disclosures to be signed and returned by 5 o'clock that very evening. I opened the attached PDF and began to scrutinize the contract details. Something was fundamentally wrong. The purchasing party was not listed as a standard family trust or an individual investor. It was registered as a limited liability company. I pulled up a public business registry on my secondary monitor and traced the company name. The structure was incredibly dense, intentionally designed to obscure the true beneficiary. The limited liability company was nested inside a larger holding corporation registered in Delaware, which in turn listed its primary operating address as a vacant strip mall storefront. A normal civilian buyer looking for a renovation project does not utilize a 3-tier corporate shell structure to purchase a neglected row house. More importantly, real estate investors generally rely on thorough inspections. They do not aggressively demand an accelerated holiday closing while explicitly waiving their right to basic property disclosures. They were moving entirely too fast, desperate to secure the deed before anyone could look closely at the paperwork. They were not buying a house. They were securing a strategic geographic footprint. I made 0 calls, no arguing with my father, no defending myself to Kinsley, no pleading with escrow. That would have granted them authority they never actually had. Instead, I packaged the documents, the shell structure, and the timeline, and filed a formal notice through the encrypted portal. Instead, I turned my attention back to my heavy, air-gapped workstation. I opened the direct, encrypted communication portal to the Secure Operations Center. I drafted exactly one formal declaration. I attached the escrow documents, the shell company registry data, and the timeline of my father's admission. I typed a single, stark sentence noting that an unknown, heavily shielded corporate entity was actively attempting to execute a rapid acquisition of a registered infrastructure node. I hit the transmit key. I leaned back in the cheap dining chair and watched the main dashboard of the Federal Asset Tracking System. For several long seconds, the screen remained unchanged, displaying the standard green operational markers. Then, the system refreshed. The green indicators vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, glowing amber alert. The text next to the Fells Point address shifted. It no longer read active status. A cold, distinct shiver ran down the entire length of my spine as I read the new classification. The machine had taken over, and the words on the screen confirmed it. The transaction was now officially locked under federal review. The call came from our regional compliance coordinator. Not a movie villain, and not a hero either. Just a voice trained to treat risk like math. "We have a transfer issue," he said. "That parcel is federally restricted. It cannot be conveyed through a standard title process without triggering review." He didn't scold me. He didn't comfort me. He just stated the reality. If your father signed it over anyway, the transaction will lock. Then the investigation will walk backward. Signatures, intent, beneficiaries, everyone involved will get touched. A heavy, sickening feeling settled deep in the pit of my stomach. This was the ultimate. devastating consequence of their blind arrogance. My parents, in their absolute certainty that they were financial geniuses, had blindly waltzed into a sophisticated trap. They honestly believed they were outsmarting the local real estate market and teaching their disappointing daughter a valuable lesson about capitalizing on dead assets. Instead, they had unknowingly facilitated a transaction with an entity that was now squarely in the crosshairs of a major federal intelligence probe, simply because they were greedy for a fast payout. They had painted a massive, inescapable target on their own backs. Despite the overwhelming weight of this realization, I forced my breathing to remain slow and steady. I didn't want them destroyed. I didn't want handcuffs or headlines, but I also knew how my world works. Once the protocols wake up, nobody gets to negotiate with the avalanche, but I also knew the rigid, unforgiving architecture of the world I worked in. I possessed absolutely zero power to stop the avalanche they had just triggered. Once the security protocols were activated, I was no longer a participant. I was merely a witness. I had no authority to shield them from the legal consequences of their own signatures. "Listen to me very carefully, Natalie," Henson instructed, his tone shifting from informative to a strict, binding directive. "You are officially isolated from the civilian side of this investigation from this second forward. You are absolutely not to contact your father or your mother. You will not call them to teach them how to hide their assets. You will not offer them a warning about the freeze. To do so would be a direct obstruction of an active inquiry. Every single interaction you have with them moving forward must be entirely transparent, fully documented, and strictly mediated through your own outside legal counsel. Do you understand these parameters?" "I understand completely," I replied without hesitation. "I will secure private civil counsel first thing in the morning." "Good. Keep your head down and let the process work," Henson said, and the secure line instantly went dead. I set the heavy black receiver back into its cradle. The silence of the small apartment rushed back in, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. It was the breathless, heavy silence of a bomb falling through the air, just seconds before the inevitable impact. I turned my chair away from the encrypted workstation and faced my standard civilian laptop. I opened the internet browser and logged into the secure online portal provided by the Maryland Title Company. This was the system designed to track the final disbursement of the sale. Just an hour ago, the main dashboard had proudly displayed a massive pending deposit, representing the remaining 80% of the sale price destined for my personal checking account. I moved the cursor and clicked the refresh button. The screen blinked white for a fraction of a second. When the portal reloaded, the large, bold numbers detailing the expected payout had vanished entirely. In their place, a stark, bright red status bar stretched across the very center of the dashboard. I stared at the new designation, reading the exact phrasing that signaled the definitive end of my family's illusion of control. Transaction flagged, /pending seizure review. The incessant vibration of my phone against the granite counter became a steady, rhythmic drumbeat of panic. Within the span of 10 minutes, my father called exactly 11 times. I let it ring. I listened to the voicemails stack up in real time. The psychological devolution of Russell Hargrove was spectacular to witness. The first message was barked out with his usual boardroom authority, demanding I immediately contact the title company to clear up a ridiculous banking glitch. By the fourth message, his tone had sharply elevated to anger, noting that his personal operating accounts were suddenly locked. By the ninth message, the bluster was entirely gone. His voice was thin, reedy, and laced with naked desperation. He was begging me to pick up, pleading that we could simply reverse the wire and make the whole thing disappear. He had finally realized he was trapped in a cage he could not buy his way out of. When the phone lit up with a call from Kinsley, I knew they had abandoned individual tactics and formed a unified front. I pressed accept and put the device on speaker. "Natalie," my sister snapped instantly, the background echo confirming she had me on speakerphone in our parents' living room. "What on earth did you do?" Before I could respond, my mother interjected. Diane had seamlessly transitioned into her ultimate defensive posture, which was weaponized weeping. "I just wanted you to be stable, sweetie," she sobbed. her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatricality. "We only wanted to secure your future. How were we supposed to know there would be some sort of problem? Why did you never explain exactly what your job actually entails? This is incredibly unfair to us." She was expertly shifting the narrative, attempting to make my necessary discretion the root cause of their federal crime. Kinsley jumped right back in, delivering a cruel, calculated strike designed to inflict maximum guilt. "She is right. If you truly never wanted that dilapidated place sold, why did you legally sign the paper giving Dad the power to do it? You handed him the keys. Natalie, you literally asked for this to happen, and now you are punishing them for helping you." "Let us all just take a breath and be rational adults here," Grant chimed in. Using his smooth, placating investor voice, he honestly believed he could negotiate his way out of a national security breach. "This is just a simple misunderstanding over a piece of real estate. We wire the cash back to the holding company, we void the final contract, we wipe the slate clean, and pretend none of this ever occurred. Easy fix." I let their chaotic chorus of blame, denial, and amateur legal strategy hang in the air for a long moment. I stared at the blinking red lights on my secure monitor. "Everything is no longer in my hands," I stated, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "And it is certainly no longer in yours either." The line went dead silent. The absolute certainty in my voice had finally pierced their bubble of privilege. Then, Russell exploded. "I will sue you into the ground," he roared, abandoning any pretense of a loving father. "If you try to pin this banking freeze on me, I will drag you into civil court for abuse of power. I will expose you. You are deliberately trying to destroy this family's reputation over a cheap row house." I disconnected the call, let him scream at an empty room. I turned my attention back to the civilian laptop. Something about my father's extreme confidence regarding his legal right to sell the property bothered me. I logged back into the title company portal and downloaded the final, executed closing packet. I scrolled past the standard disclosures and the warranty deed, searching for the specific limited power of attorney I had signed 18 months prior. I found it on page 42. My original signature was there, authorizing routine maintenance and tax payments, but attached to the back of the document was a secondary page. It was an addendum, drafted in dense, convoluted legalese, broadly expanding the definition of asset management to include fiduciary liquidation and portfolio optimization. My father had not forged my signature. He had simply used a loose clause in the original document to attach a legally dubious rider, effectively granting himself the ultimate authority to sell the house. It was a classic, ruthless white-collar maneuver. He had treated my legal proxy the same way he treated a hostile corporate takeover. The federal government would handle the national security breach and the illicit buyer. But I needed a massive, impenetrable firewall to protect my personal civilian rights from my own family. I could not rely on agency lawyers for a domestic civil dispute. I picked up my phone and dialed the emergency after-hours intake line for Stonewell and Price LLP. They were a notoriously aggressive, highly expensive civil litigation firm based in downtown Dallas. They did not care about family harmony. They cared about dismantling opposing counsel piece by piece. Within 20 minutes, I had secured a senior partner on retainer to handle the fraudulent expansion of the proxy document and the unauthorized retention of the 20% management fee. Just as I finished transferring the retainer funds, a new text message chimed from my mother. The anger had subsided, replaced by a desperate, cloying need to regain control of the narrative. "We are a family, Natalie," Diane wrote. "We need to sit down, look each other in the eye, and figure out a family resolution for this mess. Please, come to the house tomorrow morning. We can fix it." They wanted a home court advantage. They wanted to corner me in their grand living room, surrounded by their expensive art, and bully me into submission without any official record of the conversation. I typed my reply carefully, setting the final stage. "I agree that we need to meet," I sent back, "but we are not doing it at your house. I have arranged a conference room for 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. The address is attached. Do not be late." I attached the address for the heavily glassed, intimidatingly corporate offices of Stonewell and Price. There would be no crying on plush sofas. There would only be witnesses, sworn statements, and rigid legal procedures. The glass-walled conference room at Stonewell and Price was perfectly engineered to strip away any false sense of warmth. It sat on the 42nd floor, overlooking the sprawling concrete grid of downtown Dallas. Precisely at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy double doors swung open. Russell and Diane Hargrove swept into the room exactly as if they were arriving at a high society charity gala. My father wore a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my first car, while my mother draped herself in a pristine white cashmere coat, her wrists heavy with diamond tennis bracelets. They walked in radiating a smug, overwhelming confidence. In their minds, hiring a fancy downtown firm was just my dramatic way of waving a white flag. They fully believed I had brought them here to formally surrender and beg them to fix the mess. I sat on the opposite side of the long mahogany table next to Harrison, a senior partner whose billable hourly rate could finance a small startup. I stayed seated and slid the stapled affidavit across the table. I simply slid a thin, neatly stapled document across the polished wood. "What is this?" Russell asked, not bothering to sit down as he picked up the pages. "It is a basic affidavit of facts," I replied, my voice gentle, purposefully stripped of any edge. "The banks have frozen the transaction because of the sudden transfer of the deed. Harrison suggested that the fastest way to untangle the legal mess is for everyone to simply confirm the timeline, the statements made, and the exact scope of the proxy document you utilized. It is just to help my lawyer clarify the record." It was the ultimate trap. Built entirely out of politeness, I was offering them a chance to explain themselves on the official record, playing directly into my father's desperate need to be the smartest, most authoritative voice in any room. Russell let out a short, dismissive laugh, taking the expensive fountain pen from his breast pocket. "Is that all? God, Natalie, you made it sound like the world was ending. This is standard compliance paperwork." He sat down and began to flip through the pages, because he believed this was merely a bureaucratic hurdle to unfreeze his money. He could not stop himself from talking. He wanted Harrison to know exactly how brilliant his business maneuver had been. "I pushed the closing through in under 48 hours, Russell boasted, gesturing with his pen. The buyer was highly motivated. They actually offered a substantial premium, a massive cash bonus, if we bypassed the standard inspection period and signed the final addendums immediately. Obviously, I executed it. And yes, as the document states, I retained a 20% management fee for my firm. I earned every penny of it for securing such an aggressive timeline." He was openly confessing to rushing a blind real estate deal for a cash bribe and skimming a massive, unauthorized percentage off the top. I watched him smoothly sign his name next to each admission. Diane settled into the leather chair beside him, adjusting her cashmere coat with a satisfied sigh. She looked across the table at me, her eyes entirely devoid of the weeping mother routine she had performed the night before. "I told your father we should just handle this quickly," Diane blurted out, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. "I knew you would not dare make a big deal out of this once you saw the actual numbers. You always were too timid to handle real money. We did you a massive favor, taking the burden off your shoulders." With one sentence, she had completely shattered the illusion that they acted out of protective parental concern. She had just admitted on the record that they bypassed my consent because they viewed me as weak and assumed I would never fight back. Harrison remained perfectly still, his hands folded neatly over his legal pad. He looked at my parents over the rim of his glasses. "Mr. Hargrove, Mistress Hargrove, I need to ask you a very specific question for the record. When you executed this sale, were you completely unaware that the property in question was a registered site belonging to Federal Security Infrastructure?" Russell scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair. "Do not be ridiculous. It is a rundown brick box in Maryland. Natalie does data entry. Stop trying to inflate her job title to scare us." So you firmly deny any prior knowledge of security protocols attached to the property? Harrison pressed smoothly. Absolutely, Russell stated with ironclad certainty. Harrison did not argue. He simply slid a second piece of paper across the table. It was a maintenance authorization form from 14 months ago, back when my father first assumed the proxy duties. This is a work order you signed on Natalie's behalf regarding a structural upgrade to the basement, Harrison noted. Right here, in the second paragraph, it explicitly states the repairs must adhere to strict federal security protocols and require cleared civilian contractors. You signed the bottom of this page acknowledging those terms. Did you read it before you signed it? Russell stared at his own signature. A brief flicker of panic crossed his eyes, but his ego refused to let him admit a mistake. I sign hundreds of pages of contracts a week, he snapped defensively. It was boilerplate language, a standard maintenance waiver. I am not going to memorize every trivial line of my daughter's plumbing bills. I kept my voice gentle. I slid the affidavit closer. Then just sign the line confirming you received the notice. No details, only acknowledgement. He snatched the pen and angrily signed the acknowledgement, firmly believing he was just swatting away an annoying legal technicality. He had no idea he had just destroyed his own plausible deniability. Right at that exact moment, my personal cell phone buzzed against the glass table, the screen illuminated with a text message from Kinsley. I glanced down and read the words. My sister, completely oblivious to the legal snare closing around our parents, could not resist the urge to gloat about her newly acquired wealth. The message read that she had already put down a massive non-refundable deposit on the new downtown penthouse using her cut of the sale money. She explicitly stated that if I thought I was going to cancel this deal and make her lose her dream house, I was out of my mind. It was the perfect, damning twist. The money they had skimmed from a classified federal asset was already being actively spent and commingled with civilian real estate deposits. It was undeniable, written proof of a spending motive derived from a flagged transaction. I quietly took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it directly to Harrison's secure server. Russell stood up, aggressively buttoning his suit jacket. Are we finished here? I expect that banking freeze lifted by tomorrow morning. I will not have my personal accounts tied up because of your administrative incompetence. We have everything we need. Mr. Hargrove, Harrison replied politely, standing to shake my father's hand. Thank you for being so forthcoming. My parents marched out of the conference room, their heads held high. Thoroughly convinced they had just dominated the negotiation, I remained seated in the quiet room, listening to the heavy doors click shut. Harrison sat back down, neatly stacking the freshly signed affidavits into a precise pile. He leaned over the table, keeping his voice to a low, clinical whisper. They have absolutely no idea what they just did. Harrison said, Now, when the federal investigators arrive, they have completely locked themselves into their own legally binding testimony. The escalation in the real world does not look like a high-speed car chase. It looks like a slow, methodical suffocating of your resources. Less than 24 hours after our meeting at the law firm, my mother launched her second offensive on social media. Diane posted a long, tearful update claiming her own flesh and blood was dragging her aging parents through a frivolous legal nightmare. She painted a picture of a daughter maliciously exploiting a simple, well-intentioned family misunderstanding. The comments flooded in, filled with outrage from her wealthy peers, but I barely registered the digital noise. The real threat was moving silently through the financial sector. My father, realizing his bullying tactics had completely failed in the conference room, began to panic. Russell Hargrove possessed a deep, fundamental belief that any problem could be solved if you simply knew the right powerful men. He spent the entire morning frantically calling his extensive network of Dallas real estate developers, local politicians, and banking executives. He was desperately searching for a backdoor channel, a favor he could call in to unfreeze his accounts. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was currently sitting at the center of a federal risk review. Every single phone call he made, every frantic text message he sent begging for a financial bypass, was being meticulously logged by agency oversight. He was not finding a solution. He was simply expanding the radius of his own audit trail, turning casual golf acquaintances into potential witnesses. While my father was busy incriminating himself across the state of Texas, my civilian inbox received a stark communication from the legal representation of the shell company. It was a formal cease and desist letter. The buyer demanded I immediately cease all interference with the property transfer. They implied that if the title was not fully cleared and transferred within 48 hours, they would file a massive civil lawsuit seeking millions of dollars in damages for breach of contract and market sabotage. The irony was chilling. A highly obscured procurement network, a front operation actively hunting federal infrastructure, was aggressively threatening to use the American civil court system to force a national security breach. I routed the email into the secure portal and let it sit there, unanswered. I routed the email directly into the secure portal and waited. The heavy encrypted phone inside my briefcase buzzed late in the afternoon. Director Henson was on the line, and the clinical detachment in his voice had vanished, replaced by the sharp, rigid cadence of active command. "The situation on the ground in Maryland has escalated," Henson stated without any preamble. "Our surveillance teams just flagged individuals actively casing the perimeter of the Fells Point location. They bypassed the standard front door and attempted to force entry into the reinforced utility access panel near the basement node." My breath caught in my throat. This completely eradicated any lingering, naive hope that this was just a bizarre real estate coincidence. "They are not waiting for the title to clear," Henson continued. "They consider the location a burned target, and they are trying to extract whatever data or hardware they can reach before the government officially locks the deed. This confirms their primary objective was always the secure infrastructure." "What are my orders?" I asked, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "You are to remain exactly where you are," Henson commanded. "Under absolutely no circumstances are you to board a flight back to Baltimore. You will not go near that property. You will not engage with anyone regarding the physical security of that site. The agency is taking full operational control. We are handling every step from this moment forward. Keep your head down and stay completely out of the blast radius." The blast radius he mentioned was already beginning to detonate inside my family's financial world. A few hours after Henson ended the call, the absolute reality of the risk freeze slammed into Russell. I watched the automated alerts populate on my secondary monitor. My father had attempted to execute a massive wire transfer, trying to move his stolen 20% management fee from his domestic checking account into an offshore holding trust before the government could claw it back. The system did not just deny the transaction, it hard-locked his entire portfolio. He was completely cut off. He could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone fund a legal defense. The financial paralysis instantly triggered a catastrophic chain reaction within the family. My phone lit up with a hysterical, incoherent barrage of texts from Kinsley. Her escrow agent had just called her. The massive, non-refundable deposit she had confidently wired for her luxury downtown penthouse had been flagged and halted by the Federal Reserve, because those funds originated from the tainted real estate transaction. Her money was now trapped in a government holding account. Her dream home was gone. And her startup capital was deeply compromised. Kinsley did not blame our father for stealing the money in the first place. She directed every ounce of her venom at me, screaming in all capital letters that I had intentionally ruined her life, destroyed her future, and sabotaged her happiness out of pure jealousy. I ignored her breakdown and focused on the secure terminal. A new, highly classified operational directive flashed across the screen. It was an authorization code for an immediate enforcement action. A federal search and seizure warrant had been officially signed by a judge. The specific time of execution was heavily redacted, purposely unannounced to prevent anyone from destroying evidence or moving assets. The slow, bureaucratic review was over. The physical response was now in motion. As I stared at the glowing green authorization code, my civilian phone chimed one final time. It was a single text message from my mother. The performative outrage was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute ultimatum delivered right before the storm made landfall. "If you really do this to your family," Diane wrote, "you are no longer my daughter." The annual Dallas Children's Foundation Gala at the Grand Downtown Hotel was an event my mother, Diane, refused to cancel. In fact, she actively amplified its scale. She hired a professional media team to live stream the entire evening across her social channels. It was a desperate, glittering stage constructed entirely to prove to her wealthy country club peers that the Hargrove family was perfectly fine, financially invincible, and completely united against any malicious rumors. I attended the event solely because keeping my physical distance from the compromised Baltimore location was my only operational directive. And watching my family attempt to orchestrate a massive public relations rescue mission was the final necessary data point to conclude my timeline. I stood near the back of the sprawling, cavernous ballroom, wearing a simple black evening gown, blending seamlessly into the shadows cast by a towering ice sculpture. My father was holding court near the center of the room. Russell wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and projected the booming, aggressive confidence of a real estate titan. He laughed far too loudly at the jokes made by local politicians and constantly signaled the catering staff for more champagne. However, I could easily see the deep, vibrating cracks forming in his armor. His right hand twitched constantly, drifting down to the pocket of his trousers. Every few minutes, he pulled out his smartphone, staring at the illuminated screen with a tight jaw, desperately hoping the massive federal freeze on his assets had miraculously lifted. The financial paralysis was eating him from the inside out, turning his usual arrogance into a fragile, frantic energy. The carefully maintained illusion shattered very quietly. A senior vice president from my father's primary wealth management firm approached him near the marble cocktail bar. I watched from a calculated distance as the banker leaned in, keeping his voice carefully lowered to avoid eavesdroppers. I did not need to hear the exact words to know precisely what was happening. The executive was asking my father about the severe, highly unusual federal hold placed on all his liquid assets and the sudden inquiry into illicit funds. I watched my father's face cycle rapidly from fake joviality to sheer panic, and finally to outright, defensive rage. He slammed his heavy crystal glass onto the bar hard enough to chip the base, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson before he abruptly turned and stormed toward the secluded hallway. Before I could shift my position to track his movement, Kinsley grabbed my elbow. Her grip was painfully tight, her manicured fingernails digging sharply into my skin. She dragged me behind a massive floral arrangement of white orchids near the coat check. She was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with a frantic, cornered energy. Her startup company was actively collapsing without the stolen funds to prop it up, and she desperately needed a target for her rage. "You need to stop this right now," Kinsley whispered viciously, her voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. "I know exactly what you are doing. You are manipulating some obscure bureaucratic loophole to freeze Dad's money because you are bitter and jealous. If you do not call whoever you complain to and drop this entire pathetic act, I swear I will take the microphone tonight and tell everyone in this room what you really do. I will expose you. I will tell them you are just a glorified paper pusher throwing a tantrum to ruin our lives." I looked at her flushed, desperate face. She genuinely believed my career was a fragile, embarrassing secret that I desperately wanted to protect from her wealthy friends. She thought she was holding a loaded weapon to my head. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of her grip. I freed my arm, calm and controlled, and gave her a polite, almost pitying smile. "You cannot tell them what you do not understand, Kinsley," I said quietly. The words hung in the air between us, cold and utterly devoid of fear. Kinsley blinked rapidly, the absolute certainty completely draining from her face as she realized her ultimate threat had not even registered on my radar. She had nothing. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom speakers, signaling the main address. Diane glided up the carpeted stairs to the elevated stage. Stepping right into the bright, unforgiving glare of the spotlight, the live stream cameras immediately zoomed in on her perfectly powdered face, She gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium and began a deeply rehearsed, emotionally manipulative monologue. She spoke passionately to the crowd of 500 guests about the hidden trials of the modern world, the heavy burdens of success, and the ultimate healing power of family forgiveness. She was actively using a charity gala to publicly absolve herself, painting our family as a beacon of unity while her husband was currently bleeding out financially in the hallway. She never reached the end of her grand speech. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom did not slam open with cinematic violence. They were pushed open with quiet, undeniable authority. A team of federal agents wearing dark business suits stepped onto the thick carpet. They did not shout orders. They did not draw weapons. They simply fanned out across the room with terrifying, coordinated precision. Badges flashed discreetly in the dim light. A plainclothes technician walked straight to the audio board and abruptly cut the music. There was no dramatic physical struggle. There was only the horrifying, suffocating weight of absolute reality descending upon a room built entirely on expensive illusions. One agent approached the stage, speaking quietly to the event coordinator, who immediately signaled the audiovisual team to kill the livestream feed. Another pair of agents flanked my father as he re-entered the room, murmuring a few distinct words that caused all the remaining color to instantly drain from his face. They politely but firmly requested his mobile devices and his immediate cooperation. The whispers among the hundreds of wealthy guests rose into a deafening, collective gasp of horror. Diane did not scream. She simply gripped the sides of the podium, her knees visibly buckling under the sheer, unadulterated shock of total reputational annihilation. No one laid a hand on her. No one physically hurt her. She was collapsing purely under the crushing weight of public humiliation. Watching her carefully constructed social empire disintegrate into dust in real time. As the federal agents guided my father toward the main exit to transport him for formal questioning, he suddenly stopped. He turned his head, his eyes frantically searching the silent, staring crowd until they finally locked onto mine. The arrogant patriarch, the man who had sold my property like scrap metal and mocked my existence for decades, was completely gone. His face was ashen, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and his voice broke with a raw, pathetic desperation that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Natalie," he pleaded, his voice cracking horribly. Just tell them they made a mistake." I stood perfectly still in the shadows. I stayed perfectly still in the shadows. No nod, no smile, no reassurance. I simply held his gaze and let silence deliver the answer he'd earned. In that exact moment, as the agents gently placed their hands on his shoulders to force him to keep walking, I realized the absolute truth. It was the very first time in my 38 years of life that my father was looking at me as someone who held actual, terrifying power. The federal investigation concluded with terrifying speed and absolute bureaucratic precision. The illicit real estate transaction was completely voided, wiped from the municipal county records as if the ink had never touched the paper. Reversing the deed was the simple part. The catastrophic damage to my family was entirely self-inflicted, by willfully abusing the limited power of attorney and aggressively skimming a massive management fee from the sale. Russell and Diane escalated a petty family betrayal into a severe federal violation. The final devastating reality of the situation crashed down on them during their first official deposition. The Baltimore property legally carried my name on the civilian deed, but that document was nothing more than a carefully constructed ghost shell. The house was a registered, highly classified asset strictly funded by federal operational budgets, because the property belonged to the national security apparatus. Every single penny generated from that unauthorized sale was immediately classified as infected. High-risk cash flow. The government did not just ask for the money back. The Treasury Department seized it all, freezing every account the funds had touched. The fallout was absolute and unforgiving. My father permanently lost his elite real estate broker license. The board of directors at his own firm held an emergency vote and immediately suspended his executive control to desperately halt the bleeding of their corporate reputation. He was no longer a titan of Dallas industry. He was a radioactive liability. My mother faced a different, yet equally crushing, kind of destruction. Diane was systematically shunned by the entire Highland Park high society. The country club quietly but firmly asked her to surrender her membership. Her wealthy friends stopped returning her calls and canceled their charity luncheon invitations. In her glittering, superficial world, you can easily survive a scandalous divorce or a quiet bankruptcy, but you cannot survive being publicly labeled a threat to federal security. Kinsley and Grant did not escape the blast radius. Because Kinsley had eagerly used her cut of the flagged federal funds to secure the non-refundable deposit on her luxury downtown penthouse, the government seizure protocols swept right through her personal banking network. The aggressive financial contagion thoroughly spooked Grant and his precious private equity connections. When the elite investors caught wind of a massive, pending federal risk freeze attached to the family name, they instantly pulled their backing. Kinsley watched her highly publicized wellness startup collapse overnight, all because she could not resist the urge to spend stolen money. Through it all, there was no triumph in it, and no celebration either, only the quiet return of a ledger to balance. When I looked at the wreckage of their lives, I only saw a final, perfectly balanced ledger finally returning to its proper alignment. Those who knowingly forged the signatures bore the heavy liability, and those who greedily consumed the unearned profits paid the ultimate price. My civil victory was a swift, quiet formality. Harrison presented our case, and the judge ruled decisively that Russell and Diane had grossly violated their fiduciary duty. They were legally ordered to reimburse every single penny of my exorbitant legal fees. Furthermore, the court issued a permanent, ironclad injunction barring my parents from ever acting as my representative in any financial, medical, or legal transaction for the rest of their natural lives. The true tragedy of the entire ordeal was something my family would never fully comprehend. During my final debrief with the Federal Compliance Office, they asked why I granted my parents proxy power 18 months ago. I didn't give it because I trusted them. I gave it because my work carries real-world risk. Travel, audits, and situations where I can't be reached for weeks. The proxy was a contingency plan. Taxes paid, emergencies handled, paperwork kept clean. They turned that contingency into a cash grab. 3 months later, I took a transfer into a senior role in a secure infrastructure compliance division. Quiet work, heavy consequences, and a life that no longer required my family's permission. I stepped completely out of the suffocating shadow of the Hargrove family legacy. I finally lived entirely true to my own values, carrying the profound, quiet realization that I never needed their validation or their approval to know my own worth. On a quiet Tuesday evening, I stood alone on the front porch of my new, entirely unremarkable suburban home. It possessed no grand circular driveway, no crystal chandeliers, and absolutely no performative wealth designed to impress strangers. It was just a quiet, solid house. I slid the simple brass key into the lock, feeling the heavy tumbler turn with a deeply satisfying click. I looked back out at the empty street and smiled. There are families who will happily label you an asset as long as you remain perfectly silent and compliant. But the moment you stand up straight and refuse to be moved, they are forced to realize a terrifying truth. You are the one who holds the keys, and they were never, ever given the authority to hold them. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment down below and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video, and show some extra support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.